Hey folks, I'm Mark Ryan. This is Super Review, and this is the Shuoer S12. This is a 14 point something millimeter planar driver IM with a tasteful V-shaped sound signature. And if that sounds familiar, that's because it is. You might remember late last year, like the second half of 2021, the 7 Hertz Timeless came out. It was like a 14 point something millimeter planar driver IM with a tasteful V-shaped sound signature, and there's a lot in common, I think, between the Timeless and this Shuoer. So one, there's the specs, there's the general sound signature, but then if you look at these things on a frequency response, and I do have a link to my frequency response graphs in the description, you're going to see these things are very, very similar. But I really wanted to spend some time living with this and find out, how is it different? Is it better? Is it worse? And that kind of stuff. So some differences right off the bat. The main one is going to be the price. Honestly, the Timeless, right? It was pretty well priced IM, frankly. It was around 220 bucks. This is actually even cheaper. The Shuoer S12 comes in at 150 bucks. And obviously we got some physical differences to it, but we'll get into the details in this review. But before we get into it, just a quick shout out to Aoshita Audio for sending this in for review. I do have a link to them in the description down below. And like all my other live streams or all my other reviews, this is a live stream. A little spoiler there. If you're here now live, you have any questions about this, the 7 Hertz Timeless versus the Shuoer S12 or anything else that we talk about today, drop it in the live chat. And at the end of the review, we'll have a little bit of a back and forth conversation. But for now, let's just jump back to the table and start talking about the S12. And like I typically do, we'll start by talking about what's in the box and the physical stuff here. So the box that the Shuoer comes in looks like this. In fact, I think I have like another outer shell, but this is, I think, pretty handsome typography. I dig that. Nice, simple packaging. But otherwise, this is what you get inside of it, which for 150 bucks, this is a pretty, I would say, typical offering here, but we'll go through it. So you do get a little bit of a small carry case. Frankly, this is actually, I think, a little bit too small for these, especially given the density, the girth of the cable. Otherwise, like, I generally like this type of carry case because it's so slim and compact, and I'm sure you can fit these things in there, but it's gonna be a bit of a tight fit. So I don't know. I'll bring that up as kind of a downside, but frankly, I don't really use these carry cases that much anyway, personally. Apart from that, you do get a very wide selection of ear tips, which I have laid out here, including 2 different styles of silicone ear tips. We'll punch in on these so you can take a look at them up close. And yeah, I don't know. There are 2 different styles. This one over here is a little bit thinner and softer. The rubber is, I think, a little bit nicer than the silicone over here, but they are a bit odd shaped, I guess, once you get down to the small size. They're just a little bit pill-shaped. These are honestly fine, but you might notice that I'm not quite using these on my Timeless, and we'll talk about that, or sorry, my S12, and we'll talk about exactly why in a little bit. But it is nice at least that they give you a big selection of silicone ear tips, and they also include a full set of foam ear tips, which again, I don't use. I'm not a big foam tips fan myself, but if you are, it's nice that they include a set there. That's it for the accessories, so let's go ahead and talk about the IM itself and the cable that it comes on. And I gotta be honest, this is actually, I think, a really surprisingly nice cable. I honestly did not expect this nice of a cable because, well, we don't need to talk about that right now, but I did have a pre-production version of the S12 for a while. It didn't come on a cable quite this nice, and so when this came, I was pretty happy with it. If you remember all the nice things I had to say about the cable that came with the Moondrop Kato, this to me reminds me a lot of that cable. Now it does have a bit of a different color pattern to it. You see a little bit of gray mixed in with silver. So it's not quite as uniform and silver, but it's got the same level of thickness. It still behaves well. You can see that it's not especially memory prone. It is maybe a little bit on the thick side. So if you are sensitive to a thick cable, and some people, have issues with that kind of stuff, like the weight of a cable, the thickness of a cable can sometimes weigh on people's ears. For me, it's not a problem, but I have seen that issue, or seen people bring that up as an issue before. So worth calling out here. This is a cable that is on the thicker, heavier side, but personally, I quite like it. I think this is a really nicely made cable. The only thing I'll call out is that I did have to do a little bit of shaping of my ear hooks, and you can do this with a hair dryer. I don't know that it's necessarily a requirement for this thing, but for me, I found that because the 2-pin connector sits so far up on this earpiece, and because this piece is kind of tall, I found that the ear hook actually kind of went over the top of my earlobe. And so I took a hair dryer, heated it up, and bent it down so that it hooked properly around my ear, and now I don't have any issues. Other than that, one other thing worth calling out, I guess, is they do include a chin slider in here. But honestly, this is almost a useless chin slider. You can see it just slides its way around, and not a big fan of that. I ended up installing my own chin slider, which is just a little rubber washer, gasket of some sort. I don't know. That's not that interesting. But yeah, really pretty happy with the cable. The one thing I'll call out is that this does come available in a 4.4 millimeter or 3.5 millimeter variant. When you buy it, you have to decide which one you want. I was sent the 4.4 millimeter, and 4.4, if you're into balance, there you go. It's a good option and seemed like a pretty decent connector, a nice straight jack, which I tend to prefer. And I guess I'll leave it at that for the cable. So let's go ahead and talk about the earpieces themselves. And this is where you get another departure from the 7 Hertz Timeless, right? Where the 7 Hertz Timeless has kind of a, I'm going to say unique as a bit of a euphemism, but it's got a very unique round shape. And here with the Shuoer S12, it is a lot more traditional in shape and design and look. Though honestly, they actually share some similarities in terms of fit, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But honestly, I think this is actually a really nice looking IM. I like the simplicity of it. I love that there's no obvious branding or labeling or anything on it. There is a little bit of model name over here printed on the left, but it's really subtle. And I'm really pretty happy with the visual on this thing. It comes in a couple of different colors. I'm pretty sure this is the silver one. There's another one that's like a gunmetal gray. They don't look that different, frankly, in pictures, but I think they both look pretty handsome. The earpieces, I would say, are a little bit on the large side, I should say. And maybe I'll do a little bit of a fit demonstration here while we're talking about it. So, punch in there so you can see what this looks like inside my ear. And yeah, I mentioned it's a little bit on the large side. You can see that it fills up my concha pretty completely. But frankly, I do find it pretty comfortable. Now, I mentioned that the fit here shares some similarities with the 7 Hertz Timeless. And if you recall my review of the Timeless, I had issues with the fit. It's just not super stable. And the fit here with the S12, I had similar issues to it right out of the box. So there's just something to the way that the earpiece kind of juts downward into my ear canal. It's not uncomfortable or anything like that. It means that most of the support of the IM in my ear comes from, I don't know, like really kind of like the bottom outside of my ear canal, which I found not super stable. But I mentioned I switched ear tips, and that was frankly because of the fit. So I switched over here to Moondrop's spring tips, which is a bit of a cheat. But these, I guess maybe I'm just doing a little bit of a plug for spring tips. Really love these ear tips for what they do for fit. We'll talk about what effect that also had on the sound in a little bit, but there you go. I don't know if there's much more for me to say about this. So generally, yeah, I think it's a nice looking IM. It's maybe a little bit on the large side, but for me, it fits pretty comfortably. And with the spring tips especially, it actually fits really stable. So the ergonomics are surprisingly pretty solid, but out of the box, they weren't super solid with these ear tips. So your mileage may vary with that. And with that out of the way, we're done with the physical stuff. Let's talk about the sound. How do the Shuoer S12s sound? I'll dive a little bit more into the specific comparisons with the Timeless in a little bit when we do some head-to-head comparisons. But for now, let's try and talk about it in isolation. And the sound signature here, the general sound signature on the S12, I would describe as a V-shaped sound signature, right? It's got some bass boost, it's got some treble boost, and the mid-range is definitely not the focus here. So I would, generally paint that as a V-shaped sound signature. There is a bit of I would say additional treble presence here versus if we were just going with like a mild V-shaped sound signature as kind of your starting point with something like the Timeless. This has a little bit more treble emphasis, and so I think this brings it into just, I'll just call this V-shaped sound signature. It maybe is a little bit, it's got a strong clarity. I'm looking at my notes here, and I think I jumped the gun on some of this stuff. So I'm going to leave the comparisons to the Timeless for later. But yeah, just generally the sound signature here, again, V-shape with a little bit of extra spiciness in the treble. It does have a hefty bass kick to it that is very much in the mid bass into the sub bass. So it's not like a lean bass like you might get on something like a Moondrop Dusk or anything like that. So this is something I would describe as a meaty bass, but not overly thick, not overly warm. And I think because of that treble, that extra treble emphasis that you get there, it does again kind of tip it more toward clarity and a little bit less towards stuffy thickness. Okay, so what do I like about the sound here on the S12? And generally, I mean, I think that sound signature, that tuning that I just described is pretty tastefully done. You know that a V-shaped sound signature, a bassy sound signature is not necessarily my favorite. Like, I generally prefer a more mid-range tune, but it doesn't mean I'm opposed to a V-shaped sound signature. There are definitely bad V-shaped sound signatures. There are IMs that are too bassy. The S12, I don't think veers into that. I think this is a pretty tasteful sound signature. It's well balanced, maybe a smidge bright, which does have some impact on the tonality, but it doesn't skew the vocal tonality and like the naturalness of vocals, which is usually what I'm kind of concerned about when it comes to the tuning of the top end. And yeah, frankly, they do a pretty good job here. On the topic of the treble, I think that the treble here on the S12 is actually pretty nicely extended. If you look at it on a frequency response graph, that is very well evident that there is more high treble on this than there is on your average IM, but it's not, that high treble is not necessarily contributing to brightness. It's just kind of contributing to an added sense of texture and depth. Frankly, like that extended treble, I think makes percussion sound more lifelike, even adds a sense of weight to it, which is interesting. And okay, what else did I want to say here? Oh, I think related to that extended treble, these do have a good sense of micro contrast and texture. Not so much through the mid-range, because again, the mid-range is not the focus here, but through the mid-bass and the treble, the top end of the mid-range, you do get a nice sense of that micro contrast. So it's not just big contrasty V-shaped sound signature. You actually do get a bit of that texture in it. Despite the fact that I described this as somewhat on the bright side, I don't think that it comes across thin at all. It's still got that meaty bass. It still has a good sense of body to it. There has been some music I've been listening to a lot lately. I bought a few albums by the band The Smiths, if you're familiar with them. They're from like the 80s. And like a lot of albums from that time, they're recorded a little bit on the thin side. And on some of my IMs, some of my favorite IMs, frankly, they actually sound, the Smiths album specifically, sound a little bit on the thin side. And this, I think, actually does a pretty good job of adding a sense of body to it, which is kind of what you get from that somewhat hefty low end. So that's what I like here about the S12. Of course, there are going to be some things I don't love about it, and we'll talk about those now. So like the Timeless, this has that bass emphasis, and it does give it a nice sense of depth and a nice sense of body. Even has like a pretty decent physicality to it versus, like a BA. This is not BA bass. This is closer to dynamic driver bass, even though it's a different driver technology. But I don't think it quite has that same incisiveness on the sort of leading edge on those bass notes. Basically, the attack on bass I find on the S12 is a little bit on the soft side, a little bit mushy. And because the mid-range is not the focus here, I would say these things are not necessarily, I wouldn't describe these as transparent sounding. Things like vocals aren't necessarily, I wouldn't say they're recessed or anything like that, but they do get a little bit crowded out by the emphasis in the mid bass and that treble emphasis. And if you happen to be a vocals focused listener, I am, that can be a bit of a downside. The added treble that they have here, and I'm saying added in relation to what I think the same driver is doing in the 7 Hertz Timeless. The added treble here is not necessarily where I would have taken the tuning if I were taking the Timeless and tuning it to my preferences, but it does add a little extra bit of clarity and forwardness in the tuning. But again, it's a bit of an artificialness. Like, it doesn't quite bring out the mid-range again the way that I would love to. And on that same note, I do think that the treble here can veer into being a little bit strident, especially with some bright recording. So there's an album that I like to use a lot to test the treble on a set. It's by Churches. What is Love is Dead, I believe, is the name of the album. And if you listen to that album, it's got some great songs. The recordings, I would say, are pretty good, but they're definitely on the bright side. And with certain sets, and the Shuoer S12 is one of them, unfortunately, that album can be, I don't know, pretty irritating to listen to. And I think that the treble here, that's where the stridency in the treble can come out. On a similar note, I did have some issues with sibilance on the S12 initially, although, and I mentioned that I switched to the Moondrop spring tips for fit. I did actually find that switching to these seemed to solve my issues with sibilance. I mean, I didn't solve it entirely. I wouldn't say that these things are amazing with sibilant tracks. As a reminder, usually sibilance is kind of like baked into the recording, and how well an earphone handles it can depend a lot on the frequency response, but to some degree, like, there's only so much they can do. But I guess what I was saying is that treble emphasis does lend these to be a little bit sibilant out of the box, at least for me. But switching to these ear tips, which I think allowed the nozzle to fit a little bit closer to my ear and bring that resonance peak a little bit further out, doing that for me actually improved that issue. So your mileage may vary, but a bit of a warning here that depending on the music you're listening to and how exactly these things fit you, you might find them a tad sibilant. So those are my thoughts here on the Shuoer S12, but like I typically do, that's in isolation. You want to know is how do those things stack up in comparison, relative, in context to some other IMs in the price range? And that's what we're going to talk about now. So let me go ahead and throw these accessories to the side and make room for a couple of other IMs that I think are worth comparing to the Shuoer. All right, so we've got the Shuoer S12 here. Of course, we've got the 7 Hertz Timeless that we got to bring up. I'm going to also slide in this one. This is maybe a bit of a throwback, but the Tantstrim Hana, the original Tantstrim Hana. And then I'm also going to pull in the FIO FH3. You might notice a trend that pretty much all of these have spring tips on there. Again, I'm a bit of a shill for them. Swear to God, I'm not sponsored by Moondrop spring tips. But yeah, these are the IMs that I thought would be worth comparing. Now, just a bit of a top-level overview on them. Again, this is a single planar IM, $150. A single planar IM, $220. So a bit of a price gap between them. This is a single dynamic driver earphone, the Hana, and this one is about $160, although because it's a little bit old, you can usually find it for even cheaper. And then this is the FIO FH3, which is the one hybrid IM of the bunch here. This is a single dynamic driver for the bass plus 2 balanced armatures for the mid-range and treble, and this one's $130. This is actually retail price, the cheapest of the bunch, but there you go. You get a bit of a range here. We'll talk real quickly now about the sound signatures, how they differ, and I guess I'll give them a ranking, but just that I'll make the note that these preferences are definitely my preferences, and I'm going to try and describe it in a way that you can make up your own mind which one sounds more like what you're looking for, because tuning preferences really are preferences. They really are up to the individual. But yeah, let's see. The S12, like we just described, it's V-shaped sound signature with plus a little bit of extra brightness in sort of that mid-treble region. The original, I don't want to call it the original, but the Timeless, also a V-shape. I would call this one a little bit milder of a V-shaped sound signature, just because it doesn't have quite that treble emphasis that the S12 does, but because of that, it does also sound a little bit warmer and a little bit thicker versus the S12. The FIO FH3, I would describe this as kind of a bassy neutral. This is actually a very mid-range focused sound signature, but still has really just heaps and gobs of sub bass, which I think is frankly a pretty nice combination. But there you go. I would say of the bunch, it is the most mid-range focused. And then next up would be the Tachdom Hana. I would describe this as kind of a bright V-shaped sound signature, which is why I brought this one in versus this, because this is V-shaped bright. This is also, I think, V-shaped bright. But versus the S12, this is lighter on bass. This is still more mid-range focused. And I think despite the fact that this sounds more forward and a little bit on the brighter side versus the S12, I think that the treble here is a little bit, it's actually tamer. So that difference more comes in the ratio of upper frequencies to the low end, which is a little bit lighter here on the Hana. Okay, I said I was going to rank these in terms of tonality. I would say in terms of tuning preferences, I would rank them like this. I think that the File being the most mid-range focus of the bunch, with that really, like, it gives you that sub bass and there's no trade-offs there, which is really nice. So I like that. The Hana, again, still pretty mid-range focus, but a little bit more V-shaped, but still very enjoyable. And then because these two are V-shaped, I would say these two are the least mid-range focus of the bunch here. For my tastes, I put them down here, but again, your mileage may vary. If you're looking for a nice meaty mid-bass sound signature, these two are the ones that are going to be fuller there. Okay, so now let's talk about how these things rank up in terms of technicalities. And I love putting that word in quotes because, I don't know, I like to mock the word technicalities, but it's the word we've got. So let's see, the S12, well, this one's actually going to be pretty hard to rank. But I'm going to say the S12 is near the top. Honestly, these two are just about identical in terms of technicalities. I think they both have a really good sense of depth. They have nice, fast, clean treble. The bass is a little bit on the soft side with either of these, but generally pretty good there. You know, you get a good sense of micro contrast throughout the frequency range, although again, not so much through the mid range. And what I like about that is it just gives you a nice sense of texture, and it's a sense of detail. Like people throw around the word detail, and I try to avoid that to some degree. But that micro contrast to me does give sound a sense of detail that can be missing in a more macro contrasty sound signature. Next up, this one's actually kind of tough. The File FH3 I'll probably put a little bit below, although it actually does have some advantages versus these two. So I would say that the mid-range is definitely more transparent sounding here. Again, a lot of that comes from the tuning, this being a more mid-range focused sound signature. And it does have a little bit of a BA timbre to it because this one does have balanced armatures. It gives it a bit of a plasticiness that I think is especially apparent through the treble. It's not so bad here. There are definitely some BA IMs that are much worse about that. But that does affect the FH3. But where I think this thing is really strong, and where, like, if we were just ranking it in terms of bass, I think this has the best bass. It is just really nice deep sub bass that's tight. It digs deep. It gives you a really nice sense of rumble and never smears up the mid-range. Yeah, really quite love the bass. But the one that I would say is probably that sounds to me the most technical is still going to be the Tachdom Hana, the original Hana. It's just got really out of this world imaging. It gives me a really kind of incredible sense of separation between sound signatures and instruments and that 3D positioning. And that sort of thing, I don't know, maybe that kind of stuff depends on your individual HRTF, but for me, the way that I hear things, this thing is just, it's phenomenal to listen to. It's been a while, frankly, since I listened to the Hana. I brought it out for this comparison and I was still pretty blown away by that aspect of it. And then I think the bass here is actually pretty tight and pretty nice. It doesn't have quite that sting of and that sharp attack as something like a Moondrop Kato. It's a little bit softer there, but it's less emphasized here. Because of that, I don't know. I think that the bass gives it a nice supporting character without being the dominant figure here. And then in terms of treble performance, I do think that, again, despite this one being probably the brightest tuned in terms of like tonal balance, it actually, I think the treble is smoother on the Hana than it is on any of these other IMs, so there you go. And then I guess the last point we'll talk about is form factor, and I don't know, I think I'm going to go ahead and say that the S12 is my favorite form factor. I think I love the minimalistic look, and again, with the ear tip switch, the fit security is actually pretty phenomenal. And then I love this cable. I think it's really solid. Next up, I would say probably the Tonstam Hana. You know, this is just a nice, fresh looking IM. We talk about freshness in the Super Review Discord server, and the Hana kind of tops the fresh scales. The stock cable I don't love. It's not a bad cable, but I don't love it. But I don't know, it's a nice small earphone that fits in my ear pretty well. Maybe not the highest unfit security, but that's also true of these two as well. Third up, I would say the Phio FH3 fit security on this is maybe a little bit better than the Hana, but not quite as fresh looking. And you might notice I'm also using a not stock cable here on the FH3 because the stock cable on the FH3 was a little bit on the springy side, although I don't know, we'll talk about this maybe another day. I recently got the Phio FHE to review, which is basically the FH3, and the stock cable that comes on that is identical to my FH3 cable, but less springy. I don't know, maybe there's some changes in manufacturing over the past year and a half or so, but that's neither here nor there. And then finally, I will leave the 7 Hz timeless down here. Yeah, I had issues with the fit security on this thing. The spring tips do improve it, but they don't get it to a very, very secure fitting IM. And then the cable on this I just find kind of like thin and a little bit messy looking. So yeah, I don't know. I never loved the timeless in terms of that stuff. But that is how the Shuoer S12 compares to all those other IMs. And I guess that's going to bring us to the point where I got to rate this thing. So as you can see, you know, a lot of really positive things here to say about the S12. Maybe not my ideal sound signature, but again, I don't really hold that too much against it. There have been a lot of IMs that not my ideal sound signature that I nevertheless give 5-star ratings. This one, however, I'm going to go ahead and give the Shuoer S12 a very solid 4 stars, which, if you're keeping track, is actually a little bit better than I rated the timeless. So you might be wondering, do I think this is better than the timeless? And for me, it is better than the timeless in a couple of ways, maybe 3 ways. 1, the timeless, I had issues with sibilance. I had issues with sibilance here as well, but I was able to solve it here with this ear tip switch, which again, I think your mileage may vary with that, so take that with a grain of salt. But for me, this thing became more listenable with the spring tips. The fit security on this thing, I think, is also better, and just aesthetically, I like this quite a bit better than the timeless. And then the other big difference is that this is $70 cheaper. So for me, I actually like this a little bit better than timeless. I don't know that everyone's necessarily going to be there with me. You know, if you prefer a thicker, warmer sound signature, the timeless is that. This is a little bit brighter, can be a little bit more strident in the treble, but because of those other things, I actually prefer the Shuoer S12. And if you're interested in checking this thing out, I do have a link to Aoshida Audio in the description down below. And while you're down there, if you found this review helpful, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, ding the YouTube bell, and I guess I'll catch you in the next super review. Unless you want to, you know, chat, check out a link to the Discord server that I have in the description down below. I'm there probably way too much, but we've got a good group of folks that are always talking about audio, talking about Discmans. We got a room specifically for the Shuoer S12 if you want to talk specifically about the S12. We've got all kinds of good conversations going on there. But yeah, that's going to do it for this review. Again, if you're here live, stick around. We'll have a bit of a conversation, but otherwise, I will catch you on the next one. Cheers.